Hello, I'm continuing my reviews on the Texas Chainsaw Massacre movies with Texas Chainsaw 3D. Now, this came out in 2013. Now, technically, this is the 7th film in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre series. However, if you don't include the remake or the prequel to the remake as being part of the series, then that means this is the 5th film in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre series. Now, when this movie came out, I initially thought that this was going to be another sequel to the 2003 remake of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, but then I found out that this movie is actually a direct sequel to the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre, meaning that this movie is really part of the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre series. Now, that's very rare when they do that, when they make a sequel to a film that has already had a remake made to it. The only other time I could think of them doing something like that is with George Romero's Living Dead movies, where George Romero, he made Night of the Living Dead, then the sequel Dawn of the Dead, then the sequel Day of the Dead. Then in 1990 you had the remake of Night of the Living Dead, and then in 2004 you had a remake of Dawn of the Dead. But then in 2005, George Romero made the film Land of the Dead, which was another sequel to the original Night of the Living Dead and the original Dawn of the Dead. And technically they also did that with the Godzilla movies, where in 1998 you had the American remake of Godzilla, but then after that Toho started coming out with their Millennium Godzilla movies, and most of those were direct sequels to the original Godzilla, so they do that sometimes, but it's very rare, though, when you would see a sequel to a film that has already had a remake made to it. Now, even though this film is part of the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre series, the film does kind of act as a minor reboot because the film is a direct sequel to the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre, but it ignores the continuity of all the films that came in between. They essentially did the same thing with this movie that they did for Halloween H2O or Godzilla 1985. But one thing that's interesting, though, is in this movie they call the family the Sawyers. Now, in the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre film, you never found out what the family's real name was, but in Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2, you find out that the family's name was the Sawyers. So I found that to be interesting, that even though this movie is pushing 2 out of continuity, it's still keeping that bit about the family being called the Sawyers. And of course, in the remake and the prequel to the remake, you found out that the family was called the Hewitts, but the remake, of course, is set in a completely different continuity than the original series. Now, the movie is co-written by Steven Susco, who also wrote the American remake of The Grudge, and he wrote The Grudge 2, and he also wrote a movie called Red, which was based on the Jack Ketchum novel of the same name, and that was actually a really, really good movie. The movie is also co-written by Adam Marcus, who also co-wrote and directed Jason Goes to Hell: The Final Friday. Now, I remember when this movie came out, me and my friends, we actually had a chance to go see this movie, but then we went to go see Django Unchained instead, which was probably the better decision. Now, this movie was put out by Lionsgate, and this movie was really made with the intention of kickstarting a whole new series of Texas Chainsaw Massacre films, but I don't believe this movie did too well when it came out, so who knows if we'll actually see another Texas Chainsaw Massacre movie. But I believe they had the intent of making this a whole new series of films to replace their Saw series, which had just ended a few years before this. Now, a lot of people really hated this movie, and after actually watching the movie, I'll be honest, I could kind of see why so many people hated this movie. However, I will say I do not hate this movie as much as other people do, but I can see why people did not like this movie, because this movie does have a lot of problems. Now, one of this movie's biggest problems is there's a huge freaking timeline issue, because the movie opens up where it takes place literally the day after the events of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and in the beginning of the movie you see a little baby, and that little baby grows up to be the main character of this movie. The problem is the main character of this movie looks like she's maybe in her early 20s, and the beginning of the movie is supposed to be after the events of the first movie, which was in 1973, and the movie clearly takes place in 2013. And the main character of the movie, once again, is either in her late teens or early 20s, when in reality she should be in her 40s. Now, there's a movie reviewer here on YouTube called Good Bad Flicks, who is actually a really good reviewer, and he did a review on this movie, and he actually liked the movie, but he said something in the review that actually does make some sense, and it might explain the big-ass timeline issue in the movie. Apparently this movie's actually retconning the time setting of the original film. Now, the original film was set in the year 1973, but apparently this movie's retconning the time setting to the year 1983, and apparently this movie actually takes place in the year 2005. If that's the case, then the age of the main character in this movie does make a little more sense. But I'm not sure if I buy that theory, because in the movie you see some of the characters using phones that I really don't believe they had these kind of phones back in 2005, unless I'm wrong. Now, the plot of the movie is it begins literally right where the first one left off. It picks up literally a day after the events of the first one, and in the beginning of the movie, the sheriff of this small town is going to the Sawyer's house to confront them, but then all of a sudden a bunch of the townspeople start coming there as well, and the sheriff of course didn't want this, but they came there to enact vigilante justice, and they end up burning down this house, killing all the people in the house, with the exception of Leatherface and this little baby, and eventually this couple who was a part of the mob who burned down the Sawyer home, they find this baby and take it in. So then the movie jumps ahead to years later, and this baby has grown up to become the main character of this movie, whose name is Heather, and Heather eventually finds out that she was adopted, and she finds out who her real family is, and basically she finds out that this relative of hers, who is also a member of the Sawyer family, has recently died, and so Heather has inherited this mansion. So Heather and her friends go out to this mansion, and it turns out that Leatherface is in the basement of the mansion. And in the movie, you find out that the townspeople, especially the mayor of this town, are very corrupt, and really they end up being the real villains of the movie, and in the movie, Leatherface is actually more or less an anti-hero. Now, as I said earlier in this review, Texas Chainsaw 3D has a lot of problems, in my opinion. However, I don't hate this movie as much as other people do. This is one of those movies where I could perfectly understand why a person would absolutely despise this movie, but I could also understand why a person might actually really like the movie, because this movie does have some positive things to it, but overall I don't think the movie works personally, but if you like the movie, that's perfectly alright. Now, this movie's biggest issue, in my opinion, is the timeline thing. Like, I could kinda buy that they're retconning the time setting of the original film. The problem is, though, the fact that they did that, it just just created more confusion, in my opinion. And also, in the movie, the character of Heather, she's a fairly likable character up until a certain point in this movie, but her friends in this movie are absolutely despicable. And it's not even the fact that her boyfriend in the movie is cheating on her with her best friend, it's just, they're annoying. They're just annoying characters. And to me, that's not a good thing when the characters in a movie are so annoying that you kind of want to see them die. Another problem I had with this movie is the character arc that the character of Heather goes through in this movie. As I said, she's a fairly likable character at first, but once her and Leatherface figure out that they're cousins, she's almost perfectly alright with what Leatherface is doing. Now, I don't mind the idea of making Leatherface an anti-hero, because in the movie you find out that the mayor of this town, he really is the main villain of the movie, and it turns out that he might actually be even worse than Leatherface. I don't mind that idea, but Leatherface is still a bad guy, though, and I didn't like the whole thing of having Heather just be almost perfectly alright with what Leatherface is doing. Then again, maybe that was the point of the movie, to show how far Heather has fallen as a human being after seeing all this horrible shit happen to her friends and all that, but it didn't work, at least not for me. And another thing that didn't work for me is the fact that they tried to make the Sawyer family seem sympathetic. Now, I could feel sympathy for Leatherface because Leatherface is a man with the mind of a child, so he really doesn't understand what he's doing is wrong. But the rest of the Sawyer family, they knew exactly what they were doing, and are we forgetting about the horrible things that they did in the first movie? So I didn't like how this movie tries to make you feel sorry for the Sawyer family. Like, I could feel sorry for Leatherface, but I can't feel sorry for the rest of that family. Now, despite my problems with this movie, I do think the filmmakers behind this movie had good intentions. Like, it is clear that the director of this movie definitely had a love and respect for the original film, so I do think they tried with this movie. I personally think they failed though, but that's just my opinion, but I do think they tried. I just personally didn't like the movie. But there are a lot of really nice homages to the original film. For example, Gunnar Hansen, who played Leatherface in the original film, plays a character in the beginning of this movie who's a member of the Sawyer family, and Bill Moseley, who played the character of Chop Top in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2, he plays the character of Drayton Sawyer, who was the old man from the first one in the beginning of this, and Marilyn Burns, who played Sally in the original film, has a brief cameo appearance in this movie. And also in this movie, the sheriff of the small town that the movie takes place in, his name is Sheriff Hooper, which is an obvious reference to Tobe Hooper, who directed the original film. So there are a lot of really nice homages to the original film, and once again, I do think the filmmakers behind this, I do think they had good intentions. I just personally didn't care for the movie. I do think some of the acting in the movie is pretty good. Like Alexandra Daddario, however you say her last name, who plays Heather in the movie, she does do a pretty good job in this movie. Now, she also went on to be in the show True Detective. One thing that I find to be kind of funny about that is Matthew McConaughey was also in True Detective. That's two actors in True Detective who are also in Texas Chainsaw Massacre movies. Also, the guy who plays Leatherface in the movie, Dan Yeager, I think he did a really good job as Leatherface, and he actually worked with Gunnar Hansen because he really wanted to, in his eyes, accurately portray how Leatherface would actually act. So yeah, that's my review on Texas Chainsaw 3D. I personally don't like the movie, but the movie does have its merits, so check it out if you want, and bye. Hey. I noticed when I was editing this review, I said in the review, who knows if there'll be another Texas Chainsaw Massacre movie? Well, I just found out that there is actually going to be another Texas Chainsaw Massacre film in 2016 called Leatherface, and apparently this is going to be a prequel to the original film. I don't know much about it other than that, but when that movie comes out, I definitely will be seeing it and reviewing it.